All right. Oh, that's loud. I'd like to welcome you all back to the Roundtable discussion. We have about 1.5 hours for a discussion, a conversation now on the issues of academic freedom and institutional autonomy, which are fundamental values and as such defined in the Bologna process. Yet, and as we already heard, talking about those issues is always quite difficult and stays quite vague for the reason of the complexity that the last two lectures, for which I'm very thankful, have already pointed out. And I think they laid a great base for the conversation that we are about to have. So now I'd like to start actually by introducing myself. My name is Ronja Hesse. I'm a student in Germany and actually at the moment in the presidency of the German National Student Union and as such also part of the European Students' Union, which is co-organizing this event. And so now the four people around me will have the chance to have a brief introductory statement after I introduce them. And then we can start to have firstly maybe a general discussion on the importance and the complexity of academic freedom, institutional autonomy and related civic values. And then we try to get a little more concrete also, coming back to what has already been said, that what we are doing here right now is going to lead into what can happen in the Commodification in Rome 2020 and also feed into the Bologna process in the future. And this is what we are hoping for, obviously. So I hope we can all benefit from the diversity we have here on the panel when it comes to perspectives on academic freedom, because we have four very different approaches sitting here with me. Yes, I hope that's going to be very beneficial. So I'd like to start with Sjoerd Bergen, who's sitting on the far left, who is at the moment head of the educational department in the Council of Europe. And here he is very, very experienced in the Bologna process, actually, as he's been representing the Council of Europe in the BFUG many, many times, and has also been involved in several working groups and writing the Lisbon Recognition Convention. Also, he's co-running or part of the project of the refugee passport, which I think is very interesting. So I'd like to give the word to Sjoerd.
Thank you very much, Ronja. Let me start with a commercial. We're distributing a statement adopted by a conference on academic freedom, institutional autonomy, and the future of democracy held in Strasbourg last week by the Council of Europe, a group of US higher education institutions, but also the Magna Carta Observatory and the International Association of Universities. So for you. And that was before my 3 minutes start. But I think this statement is also an indication of why the fundamental values of the European higher education area are now on the agenda much more than previously. We thought we could take them for granted. We can't. Livio and Yannicka this morning gave us very solid insights into the dramatic issues, really the political issues. So let me use my 3 minutes here to point to some other reasons, perhaps less dramatic, but perhaps not less important. We have tended in Europe to see academic freedom and particularly institutional autonomy, which are not one and the same, even though we tend to think they are, but we tended to see them as a question of the legal relationship between higher education institutions and public authorities. It's a bit more complex, and I think we need to develop a more nuanced understanding. For example, what's the impact of financing? Yannicka mentioned this morning the issue of research contracts financed massively by a private sector company. What is the impact of single source financing? And how much can you diversify financing? Few would argue that higher education institutions should break the laws, and few would argue that they should be exempt from, say, public safety regulations for laboratories or public accounting. But what are the impacts, for example, of labor legislation on higher education? And not least, what is the proper role of public authorities. Because if you speak about institutional autonomy in particular, you also talk about the role of public authorities. Now, I originally come from a country that is long and narrow, and where certain parts of the country are very sparsely populated. If the public authorities decide that a certain part of the country is underserved in terms of higher education, I think it's legitimate for the public authorities to establish, offer in those parts of the country. It might be legitimate for public authorities to say we will fund, for example, research and study programs in this case, a specific minority language, Sami, but it would not be legitimate for public authorities then to dictate what that study program should teach, for example, about the relations between the minority and majority population. Student and staff participation, I think, are also very important parts of the values of the Bologna process. We need to continue to develop that. There has been a shift in the governance model of higher education, which has been kind of quiet. There may be good reasons for that, but they haven't really been discussed that much. By increasingly moving toward a model where the representation on the governance bodies is quite heavily external, we are in a sense redefining the kind of competence that we need to govern higher education institutions, from a primary competence in research and teaching to a competence in the relationship between broader societies and the institution. Now, there may be good reasons to take this into account, but that point has really not been made in the discussion. I think I'm running out of time probably, so I'll leave my other comments for the conversation afterwards.
All right, thank you, sir. Then we'll move on to Rob Copeland, who's sitting right next to the left of me. He's at the moment the policy officer of the University and College Union of the UK. And here especially also dealing with issues of education policies and academic freedom. And also he's chair of the Higher Education Research Standing Committee of ETUCE. And yeah, you feel free to hold your introductory speech.
Yeah. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation on behalf of the ETUCE, which is the European Federation for Education Unions, representing from early childhood up to higher education, and I'm here in the capacity of the higher education sector. The advantage of following Sjur and the excellent presentations this morning is that a lot of what I was going to say has already been said very, very eloquently, so I will keep my remarks short. I think we first of all very much welcome the increased emphasis on fundamental values that is taking place in the Bologna process. It has been a neglected topic, and I think particularly the issue of academic freedom, more so than institutional autonomy. And I think really there are two key threats or challenges facing us. I think the first one has already been well rehearsed this morning, which is the kind of rising political authoritarianism across the European region, but also globally, where universities are being particularly targeted, staff and students, because of their critical thinking, their independence, and the extent to which their values of internationalism and equality clash with the rising authoritarian nationalism. And there's a key role for us in the trade union movement, student movement, and I think rectors, organizations and individual academics in challenging that. But what I wanted to talk about was perhaps more some of the sort of softer or subtler pressures or constraints that exist on academic freedom, which I think, as Sjur has said, have tended to be a bit more neglected in current conversations about fundamental values and academic freedom. And for us in the trade union movement, that is very much around the commodification or commercialization or marketization of our higher education and research systems. And I think that has a number of dimensions. I think Shaw's already mentioned issues to do with financing or funding models and how we assess or manage teaching and research, and how that is perhaps closing the space for certain types of disciplines or certain types of publications or certain types of teaching materials or teaching methods. But also issues to do with governance. I think the relationship between governance, academic freedom and institutional autonomy is very important and needs a kind of a closer examination. And one issue which hasn't been raised so far is crucial for us, but it does have links with academic freedom, and that is the increased insecurity of employment for academic staff and for university staff, because a key condition for guaranteeing academic freedom, as outlined in international treaties like the UNESCO's statement, which has already been mentioned, is some form of job security, either tenure or its functional equivalent. And I think that needs to be much more part and parcel of the discussions that we have in Europe. And I think that does unite the Turkeys of this world with the UK, where I'm from, and Norway, and the more publicly funded and governed models. So I think that needs to be part of the discussion and going forward with in terms of the future of the EHEA. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Rob. I think also for most student unions, those are very, very crucial issues in the debate. Now I'd like to give the word to Daniel Kontowski, who's a graduate from the College of Liberal Arts of Warsaw, and now is a postgraduate research student at the University of Winchester. In his research, he focuses mostly on liberal arts, and also wrote a book which is freely available on the students' perception of liberal arts study courses and liberal arts. And he is also an associate member of the Center of Higher Education Futures of the Aarhus University. So thank you for being here.
Thank you for your invitation, and thank you for the introduction. When I say that I'm researching liberal arts in Europe or liberal education in Europe, very often I'm getting the kind of looks that I get right now, which means that people are fundamentally sympathetic, but they are not exactly clear what I am talking about. And that was basically the core premise of my last few years as a researcher, trying to find out what people have in mind when they say they are doing liberal arts in Europe today. So this was my core project for the last few years, and I found out that many different things are being called liberal arts education in Europe. So in our work at European Liberal Arts Initiative, we have decided that the only actual criterion that we can use is self-description. When people say they are doing liberal arts, let's believe them for a moment and let's see what they are doing, and then let's compare what they are doing with each other. But the reason why I'm here is not because of this large research and existential questions. The reason why I'm here is because among those many models, they might be the answers to the what question, but there is also a why question. And the why question correlates or coincides with the Bologna process, because those initiatives, over 100 programs right now that produce more than 15,000 graduates with bachelor degrees in liberal arts education or liberal arts and sciences education, are actually getting bachelor degrees. So, which led many scholars to claim that because those programs started appearing in the early 1990s in Eastern Europe and a little bit later in Western Europe, and they coincided with the bachelor master structure and the division of those two, some scholars said Bologna process caused or helped liberal arts education in Europe. Others said it didn't, and others said it's irrelevant. So this is something that that puzzled me and my co-author, and this is something that I'm going to dig a little bit deeper after that, through the lenses of the academic values that we are supposed to talk about today. Thank you.
All right, thanks to you. Now I'd like to welcome Paolo Maria Maccarella, who is a computer scientist, and he graduated from the University of Pisa, and his academic career led him through many different institutions, actually, also to London. And throughout his time, he worked through about many different topics, also about teaching and learning, students with disabilities at higher education institutions, and now he's the rector of the University of Pisa, and I'm very glad you're here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Thank you for the opportunity you gave us. My contribution comes from my experience of the last 3 years, nearly 3 years of being director of the University of Pisa. And what I've noticed is that in my university, but I think in many universities, we definitely have a participation of all the community, even when it's separate from the administration of the university, the community who is a recipient of the services the university gives, as the students are. There is an involvement. The community cooperate and to solve the problems. But there is a lack of real involvement of the community of the students, in particular in the university administration. The users, the students are involved through the mechanism of representation. As you know, they have to pass an electoral screening, which is not really participated in our university. And what I would like to point here is that I think we need to develop new forms of involvement, new forms of education to democracy for our students. You know, the Bologna process puts students in the center of the university's objectives. So we need to find out new forms of direct involvement of the students as the user in the administration, in the co-administrations of the services we provide to the students. The students are both, you know, they are the user, they are the target of our public services, because remember, universities give public services, essential services like higher education, but they're not directly involved as the whole, as the community to the management. So I think the university can be a workshop where to experiment forms of co-management involving directly the users. This is what I would like to point here, then we leave it to the discussion.
All right, thank you very much. I'm very curious to hear more about that form of involvement of students, for obvious reasons, maybe. I think what we can see is that this is we have many different approaches here, so I'm excited how we can manage to get it together and get a red line through the roundtable discussion, and I hope you can help me with that later when we open up the debate. So the first question I have is directed to Shur. You already pointed out various threats to academic freedom, and before we go into those, I would like to ask you to point out from your perspective why academic freedom is so crucial for a democratic society, because this is where we should start when we talk about academic freedom and as a core value in the Bologna process. So could you maybe give us some thoughts on that?
Well, the short answer, I think, is that academic freedom and institutional autonomy are very much part of democracy, so that is really a part of what we are as Europeans. I think it's interesting to note that even when democracy is attacked, it is still the reference. You know, some political leaders talk about a liberal democracy, which of course undermines the very notion of democracy. Nevertheless, they feel a need to refer to democracy pretending to defend it while in fact undermining it. There are very few countries in the world who don't organize elections somehow. I'm not saying they organize free and fair elections, but they feel the need at least to go through the forms of democracy. But I think there's a more fundamental reason for why we need to see academic freedom and institutional autonomy as part and parcel of democracy. We cannot progress as societies or as academics without the will and ability to question the present or the past. So if you want our societies to stop short in our tracks, or if you want our societies only to make technological progress, and I'm not saying this is not important, but it's not everything, then by all means restrict academic freedom and institutional autonomy. I mentioned the conference that we held in Strasbourg last week. A good friend who is actually a former president of the European Students' Union, but is now education advisor to the president of Romania, said that as a historian in Romania today, there are two aspects of Romanian history that you had better not question or delve too deeply into the current narrative about. One is the Antonescu regime, and the other is the transition in 1989. I think all of our societies have a certain, some sacred cows. And of course, questioning, dialogue should be respectful, but it is nevertheless important that it takes place. Can I just make a final point also about the governance arrangements? I think it's important that there be a dialogue also through the governance arrangements between broader society and the academic community. So my previous remarks, I think, pointed out that there has been a shift that has not really been debated very much. I think it's sound that broader society also has a better insight into and influence on what happens within institutions. I'm less sure that it's actually sound if broader society alone has the majority in the governing bodies. Part of the discourse today is also to see students as clients rather than as members of the academic community. I think one of the achievements of the Bologna process is that ministers said very clearly twice in 2001 and 2003 that students are members of the academic community. Now, the difference between being a client and a member of the community is fundamental. If you're a customer or a client, you're not interested in the internal workings of the institution. You are basically interested in whether the institution delivers the services you want to buy, and if they don't, you move on. If you're a member of a community, you have a stake in that community and you fight to change it. And only extreme cases do you migrate, in other words, leave out of it. So it's much more than a semantic difference. The difference between seeing students as consumers and seeing students as members of the academic community, I think, is fundamental to the future of higher education in Europe.
All right. Thank you. Rob, Shu just characterized universities as a critical driver for change in a society, and in that way also as a key point, like academic as a key aspect in a democratic society, if I got you right, Shu? Or that was one of the
I think
points.
Universities should be key drivers of change. Now, change is sometimes used as a goal in itself. Mm-hmm. It matters a great deal what kind of change you're trying to achieve. Change can be good and change can be bad. But sometimes we could perhaps wish that universities were a bit more, change-oriented.
All right. So, but yet universities can be or should be an institution that questions what is there in order to foster change as well. And then you also pointed out the way that students are perceived and the difference between clients and members of a society. And now I'd like to ask you, because you already pointed out the issue of commodification of higher education, if especially looking at that, commodification of higher education is not a very, very important threat to talk about, also because it could lead to higher education institutions be more affirmative to the society as it is, in contrast to what it could be or what it should be, and as a critical player, as Shur pointed it out. So do you think that commodification of higher education has gone too far in some European higher education area countries? And do you think that that bears the risk of actually undermining fundamental values such as the academic freedom?
Thank you. As probably indicated in my opening address, the answer to that is yes. And I think probably because partly I'm based in the UK and England, which I think has gone further down the road within the European higher education towards the marketisation of its system through, colleagues mentioned the high levels of tuition fees, but linked to that is a kind of growing conception of students as customers in that space, which leads to a focus primarily on issues to do with value for money and also issues to do with kind of graduate outcomes, labour market outcomes. And that in itself has led to a whole kind of panoply of new forms of assessment of outcomes of universities in terms of teaching, but also more performance management of the staff that teach. I think linked to that is a kind of growing emphasis on performance-based funding in research, which is not just a peculiarity of the English. I think we've gone down that route of funneling money through project-based funding. I think which leads to, I think, a bias towards certain types of subject areas, particularly in the hard sciences, opposed to the kind of arts and humanities, and a more focus on outputs which are fundable, that receive high rankings in terms of journals and so on. So I think, and colleagues have mentioned the issue around governance, staff and student participation, I think has been weakened or reduced on many governing bodies, not just in the UK but across Europe. And I think that combined with this issue of increased focus on employers being flexible in terms of their use of the academic workforce, so more use of short-term contracts, precarious contracts, means it's difficult for the staff on those contracts to kind of really speak truth to power, to be able to kind of raise critical questions about the way their institutions are run or how the funding model takes place, because they are more concerned about the continuity of employment. And these are hard things to kind of, that they don't reach the front pages of the newspapers. They are often issues to do with self-censorship and more subtle pressures at play. But I do think that we should be more alert to the potential for those in limiting the kind of actualities of freedom to teach without undue interference, freedom to research without undue interference. And so I do think that needs to be part and parcel of the discussion, both at the institutional level, the national level, but also in terms of thinking through the future of the EHEA in terms of 2020 and beyond.
Yeah, I do have another question about the working conditions later, but now, firstly, I'd like to ask back, do you think that it is at all legitimate to apply market rules towards higher education institutions? Because I think we are all on one page when saying that there is commodification of higher education in all the countries that I know of, at least. So what would you say? Is it legitimate at all? And if so, to which extent? And then maybe afterwards I ask a question about the working conditions, because I think that's a very crucial issue.
Well, I think two things. I mean, on behalf of ETUCE, I mean, we very much believe that higher education is a kind of public good and a human right, so access to higher education. So, you know, we favour it being freely accessible and not charging in terms of fees. because of that fundamental principle. In terms of other issues around, say, like, for example, accountability of public funding, we understand that there is a role that governments or institutions need to account for how they spend public money or through teaching and research. I think the problem is that the balance between the two has gone too far in terms of kind of intrusive forms of accountability in terms of performance management of institutions, but also of staff. I think it seems like an ironic way where you think you're bringing in more market processes that will lead to more freedoms for institutions and staff. It's often not the case, because you have to kind of regulate the market, and often it leads to new forms of intervention, which I do think, when combined in totality, can have a slightly insidious effect on the core values of freedom to teach, freedom to research, participation in governance, democratic governance. I do think it does have that fact. Clearly it does vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction in Europe. That's clearly the case.
All right, thank you. So we're going to move on. The Bologna process itself is often associated with promoting or even causing growing commodification of higher education, and in that sense, one could try to classify the Bologna process itself as a threat to academic freedom, even though it is trying and saying that it wants to safeguard academic freedom and institutional autonomy. So, Daniel, you are dealing mostly with the field of liberal arts. Maybe could you give us an insight on what you think if the Bologna process portrays a threat to the values of academic freedom and integrity and service education as a common good? Like, thankfully, also with some examples from the liberal arts field.
Thank you. Well, let me just say that in the UK, the growth of liberal arts programs did not appear around the time Bologna reforms were being implemented, but it appeared after the tripling of the fees for the student tuition. Suddenly, universities decided what we are doing is not enough. We need to differentiate what we are doing. We need to provide a better offer. And now we have over 20 liberal arts programs in the UK that weren't there 10 years ago. So that's a very recent opportunity, and obviously stratified on those three different levels. But which leads me to the question of integrity, of course. We can, if we assume that liberal education can be perceived as a gift of an interval, as Michael Hochschild put it, the period when you are free to not think about employability, not receive a service from a university, but rather step aside, take your time to understand better what they're doing, then the promise of the Bologna process, as I see it, was to create a bachelor level that would allow you to do that before the master's degree is going to be probably more professionally oriented, and a PhD would have a separate goal. And the issue is that this did not really happen. I think that we have created the structures, but we didn't differentiate across those different levels, to the extent that liberal arts programs are struggling because their graduates are often not accepted by the master's programs, because master's programs require to have a bachelor in the same discipline, and obviously there are no master's programs in the liberal arts. It's not a usual situation, it's not universal, but this is very often limiting the input of liberal arts. In terms of a common good, well, if we hold on to the idea that liberal education was always about doing something worthy of a free man, and both free and man were not universal descriptors in the past, and are not today, then this Bologna process helped the liberal arts in the sense that that the climate of student-centeredness, the climate that we move the education from being oriented on the teacher and the content to the student and the skills or the outcomes or whatever, this was helping. But on the other hand, yes, the employability agenda and the controlling for employability have threatened and limited the potential of liberal arts. And liberal arts today is still an elite, very small, and typically serving elite population of the students, regardless of the country that you are talking to. And finally, about the academic freedom, well, if liberal education is the most academic education available, meaning the education that disregards to a certain extent disciplinary boundaries because it believes in the university and the unity of knowledge, then of course this kind of language of releasing students from departmental cages that appeared in some of my interviews was helpful for increasing the academic freedom, especially when we consider academic freedom not of just consisting of freedom to teach and freedom to research, but also freedom to study. Whether you as a student are able to study what interests you, or whether the limitations are so big as what you are supposed to do at the university, that you are just being tracked into a very narrow pathway. But so in this sense, the opportunity for co-creation of curriculum introduced by the modules, by the credit system, by the recognition of degrees certainly helped. But on the other hand, one can wonder if the model of the Bologna process that was open method of coordination between government, but really quite strict adaptation within the countries, where the ministries turned the Bologna into a decree, and the universities causing actually some opposition in the universities to the Bologna process that was quite soon. So in this sense, in Eastern Europe, for example, liberal arts programs have stopped appearing after the Bologna reforms have been enacted, because of the bureaucracy that has increased, because of the quality controls, and because the liberal arts degrees are too unique. They do not fit the larger governmental frameworks, and this is then a threat or a limitation. So this is the kind of ambivalency that I think we need to be aware of. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Before we move on to talking more about concrete measures, where I think Paolo can offer a lot from his personal experience at the University of Pisa, I'd like to give the word back to Shur, asking him to contextualize it maybe also with regards to education as a public responsibility and as a public good, if you could do me the favor.
Thank you, Anya. There's one thing I think that Marxists and neoliberalists have in common. They both believe that the ownership of the means of production is primordial, although they don't think they don't have the same view of who the owners should be. Ministers have said that higher education is a public good and a public responsibility. I think the most important part of that statement is the one that is emphasized the least, namely the public responsibility aspect. Higher education is a mix of a private and public good, but it should be a public responsibility. So public authorities should have the sole responsibility for the education systems. They should have a primordial responsibility also for ensuring equal opportunities within that system. But the system can, of course, also have private institutions, but they should operate according to rules and regulation established by public authorities. So if you have an Italian qualification, it's an Italian qualification regardless of whether it's a public or a private institution that gives it, because it's been recognized as part of the Italian higher education system. And then public authorities also have a strong responsibility, but not the sole responsibility for financing higher education. Rather, part of this discourse is that we need value for money, and it's difficult to disagree with that. But we also need money for values, and that's a public responsibility.
All right, thank you for that statement. think we heard a lot now about the general field of academic freedom, and also about the various threats to academic freedom. But we are here in order to develop something, in order to make it happen in the Bologna process. So now I'd like to ask the participants to go a little bit deeper into actual concrete measures on how to change, how to address the issues that they have pointed out. And Paolo, you already pointed out the issue of student engagement and community engagement in a way in higher education institutions. So, and in your abstract you wrote that you want to avoid that the design of the university of the future will be defined by the logic of the global markets. And maybe you can, give us some insights in how you think the concept of co-management can be helpful with that not happening and actually having different involvements in higher education institutions.
You see, the point is that what Shura said earlier on, and the other participants here, and in his talk yesterday, students in our universities are the recipients of the services which are constitutionally protected needs: education, training, higher education, culture, let's say, in general. And we still guarantee, at least in Italy, to them the access, vast access from the public budget to these services. But what I think is that we could protect their needs even more, even better, if we would allow them to participating in the managing of the services we give them. Co-managing with the apparatus. So universities are, universities are an example in which services are very close to the users. There is a very closeness link between the users, students in this case, and the administration. And services in some cases are extremely simple. So we could exploit user involvement, the students' involvement in the managing from the bottom. So to experiment a form of direct democracy. This is how I think we could do in our university. We could be a real example, a real workshop in which direct democracy and representative democracy can be mixed together, can work together. And this is, for the future, this is how we could better educate our students to building up the university and the services of the university of the future, cooperating directly as a community, you see, to the managing of the services.
Can you say a bit more on how you think that could work organizationally? Like, because we do have student involvement on like different levels. So maybe you can like say how you differentiate like that form of involvement that you pointed out, the co-management, in comparison to like just representation of students and representative involvement. Because I think that's like, it's a crucial differentiation, and maybe you can make it a bit clearer.
Yes. This is exactly what I mean. What I think is that we should go beyond go further to the logic of representatives or representation. This is not enough. This is not enough. Students representatives in our councils, in our academic senates, in our board of directors are the result of an electoral process which involves, very few students, unfortunately. At least this is what happens in my university, in many Italian universities. I would like to talk about the community of students, to involve the students as a community, not through their representatives. Think, for instance, to the management of the international offices service in our universities. We are here in Bologna. We have experience with Erasmus. whom better than the students that have participated to Erasmus programs, to incoming and outgoing students, know exactly what the problems, what the real problems they have to face with are. They know them. They know from their experience, from their mates' experience, and they can bring us solutions or proposal of solution to the problems they found, to simplify the difficult procedures that they have to face with when they try to participate to this program. You see, so a bottom-up approach. We don't give regulations and then apply the regulation. We build up the regulation from the users' experience, direct experience. This is. I hope sorry for my rusty English, but...
No, I think it became way clearer now. I'm just wondering, so do you think that the Bologna process is also the place to push for a development like that, like basic democratic involvement of students at all levels and also in management processes? And do you think there should also be the demand in like setting free the resources for that and the freedom for that? Because this is like...
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. The student-centeredness of the Bologna process can be exploited also in this respect. And I think our university should now concentrate on this direct involvement of students for the, for having better universities, for having better educated new generations to the democracy.
All right, so I guess we have a direct task to the higher education institutions here, and also something to talk about when it comes to the Bologna process and Rome 2020, sorry. Thank you. I'd like to make a brief excursus to the topic that's been touched upon in the lectures that we had beforehand, and that's how do we actually measure academic freedom. It's already pointed out how extremely difficult and resource intensive measuring measuring academic freedom can be and is, and how the different forms of threats to academic freedom make it so complex. And my impression is that sometimes the Bologna process is not the process that defines itself by portraying complexity, even though it's a very complex process, but it still likes its yellow, red, and green maps and all of that. And this is something that's not so easily done when we talk about academic freedom and also, for example, about social dimension. So I would like to ask you also with regards to the lecture that we heard by Yannicka this morning, how would you think, Rob, inside the structures of the European higher education area and the Bologna process, how could we implement actual monitoring and actual measurements better, even though it is so complicated?
Thank you. Well, I think I was touched upon earlier in the previous lectures that there is a task force that's been established as part of the Bologna follow-up group, specifically looking at the issue of the future monitoring of values. And it's still very much in its early days, but we've had, for example, an experts hearing to try and tease out some of the issues that we've discussed today, and both organisations presented were involved in that. I think what we see at this stage is really, it's a staged process, which I think was already mentioned earlier, that we're going to need to kind of come at least to the ministerial conference with some sort of definition that's accepted, particularly on academic freedom, but possibly other values as well. But I think that academic freedom is the key one that's emerging. And then I think we're talking, Bologna moves in very slow timelines. I mean, for good reasons as well, because it's a sort of dialogic process, it's participatory. I mean, it does move on that sort of speed, but, the next stage, I think there is some clear sense in which some form of de jure analysis of legal or constitutional protections of academic freedom, that there is kind of greater clarity or comparability with that, I think, aspect of it, that could be the next stage, I think, in the cycle. But at the same time, recognising that the limitations of that, and to try and get to the issue around monitoring of policy and practices is a longer term goal. But it's essential, I think, if we are going to kind of get that complexity within the confines of issues of comparability. But I think the point made about measurement and monitoring, it's absolutely essential, but we also need to think about it's not the only goal in town, because we risk that becoming the measurement, and everything is, like with rankings in general, it can be a tool which kind of deflects from other key aspects of the debate. So I think what we need is the continued support of active student unions, active staff associations, rectors organisations. The kind of civil society underpinning of this work needs to go alongside the practical monitoring, measuring aspect, which is obviously a key part of Bologna, but it will not succeed if it's just purely a technical issue. So we do need to kind of link it to these broader societal and political issues that underpin the reasons why we are looking at this issue now in the way that we haven't done in previous periods.
Sure. You're driven by similar questions as well, from what I've read in your abstract, and you already also said in your statement in the beginning that we need a more nuanced view on how academic freedom and institutional autonomy can best be developed and safeguarded in modern and complex societies. So I'd like to ask you to comment on what Rob just said, and maybe also you can point out what the role of the Council of Europe can be in that regard, as one player in the Bologna process, and also looking at what can be done actually. Yes.
Thank you. Well, of course, we're a values-based organization, and I think that's really, Council of Europe is devoted to democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, and I think all three, in a sense, enter into the discussion here. I would perhaps also pick up on something that Livio said, namely measurements. Yes, I'm cautiously optimistic, but with a somewhat emphasis on caution, but it's also the vision, which is important. It may be useful to distinguish in the further work that we're going to do in the Bologna process, and like Rob, I'm also on this task force that will try to come up with at least an understanding of what we're talking about, and possibly some indication of how we can, more than measure, perhaps assess. It might be useful to distinguish between the sort of dramatic political aspects of this and the more across the board, I hesitate to use the word trivial aspects. When it comes to the relationship between financing and autonomy and academic freedom, when it comes to the relationship to general laws, when it comes to the relative role of public authorities and institutions, these should be aspects on which it should be possible to have a reasoned discussion. When it comes to the more dramatical political issues, I'm less optimistic. We've already seen in the Bologna process that we had a huge discussion on what it means to be a voluntary process. We all agree that joining the Bologna process is voluntary. Once you're inside, is it voluntary to keep up to your commitments or not? My view is it's not. And we're now through a peer learning process on some key commitments on structural reforms, quality assurance, recognition, qualifications, frameworks. Now, it may be painful for a minister to admit that, yes, my country still has quite a lot to do before we can join ENCA, before we can really self-certify our qualifications framework, etc. I think admitting that my country doesn't really provide academic freedom and institutional autonomy is so intimately linked to admitting that I'm not really democratic, that's for the individual country a considerable step. And it also has proved difficult for ministers of the other member countries to tell a colleague, listen, your government is really not democratic. We have to try to address that. But the way to address it, again, I think, is holding people accountable, but also showing ways in which they can improve, not by excluding them from the good company, but by bringing them in. This is also one reason I was among those who strongly advocated that Belarus should accede. We know that Belarus is far from perfect, but the consequences of leaving Belarus and other countries that have a less than perfect record on these issues outside are much worse than bringing them in.
Okay. I have two last questions, more to the right side of the table from my perspective, before we open up the floor. Firstly, Daniel, I would like to ask you firstly if you think that academic freedom in the Bologna process to come should play a more crucial or even key role in, for example, the Communiqué of Rome 2020, and then maybe you can shortly point out some visions that you have in order to make the Bologna process be functioning in a way that it actually can do justice to specific programs like the liberal arts programs, because you pointed out that sometimes that's not entirely possible, and maybe you can give us some hints on how that could be changed.
Well, personally, I think yes, it should, but that's the easy part of the answer. I think what we need to create or maintain is the space for experimentation, the space for academia itself to find solutions for creative use of university autonomy. And the reason why I believe in that is because 30 years ago, it seems, 30 to 20 years ago, it seemed that especially in Eastern Europe, after the democratic transformation, there was a lot of space for this kind of experiments, and there were even awards for this kind of uses. And I think we have lost it, and I think we also got a little bit tired by the pressure to innovate, in a predefined way. What I would urge or ask then, if my reading of liberal education in Europe is right, and my reading is that it has to do with ontological complexity, with transformative pedagogies, and offering an organizational alternative to the dominant ways and means of a research university that we have, then I would like to maintain a space in the future Bologna regulations where we can experiment along the lines of liberal education or some other lines, but to do justice to those free elements or free perceived visions. Because I don't think that Bologna process has really helped us in those free areas so far, but I think that if it was allowed, if it was encouraged for people to come up with something along those free, I think it would reinvigorate people involved, and we would ultimately benefit not only ourselves, but the society and the students first and foremost. So this is what I would propose. But I'm not a policy maker, so I cannot tell you what you need to exactly change somewhere.
So we need room in the Bologna process for experiments, and also room to fail, I guess, with the experiments. I guess that's, from my perspective, very important, and often, especially in performance-based higher education institutions, gets lost. Paolo, do you think that the form of community engagement that your university is trying to push for, and you pointed out, can be a guarantee for safeguarding academic freedom on an institutional level? Do you think there is a direct correlation between having basic participation of staff and students in the way that you pointed out, and safeguarding academic freedom?
Let me say first, a general comment on academic freedom, what we should do in the future. I think that one key point is to maintain and develop further the cooperations network of universities in Europe. So we have to ask for funding of a real network. We have some examples in research, in education, but especially to develop common programs of studies in all over Europe, with involving many universities and of many countries. This is, to me, a form of protecting academic freedom independently, you see, of the political political government of the various countries. This is crucial to me. So the next European program should put money and sustain really the constitution of academic networks, not only in research but also in training and higher education. We have some programs, we have some experiments, but we have to do more on this, I think. And this is a way to protect, I think, academic freedom. As far as my experiment with that, I haven't tried yet, but I would like to try it in my university of co-management. I think that this also is, as I said before, is an experiment of participated democracy in which we involve students, staff, teachers, and this is a way of protecting autonomy and of protecting freedom, I think. This is, at least, is a hope. We should start from, simple examples, simple services, and then, expand the experience to a wider perspective.
All right, thank you very much. Now we have the chance to open up the panel or the roundtable, and you all have the chance to ask questions, general questions, but also very gladly questions that are directed to what's happening next year in Bologna, in Rome 2020. So does anybody want to ask a question to one of the panelists? I know we had several topics on the round table here, which is not actually a round table. But yes, so anybody? There's a question back there.
Dorota Dakowska from Lyon. If I understood well, in a few days, Turkey is going to co-chair the BFUG. I guess it is an issue for the BFUG and also, of course, for the Council of Europe. There will be a BFUG board, I think, meeting in September in Turkey. So would it be possible to have some information about the debates it reveals, and whether you think that there are some possibilities to make pressure on Turkey in that way during these debates concerning the academic freedom and the fact that, as mentioned before, many colleagues are now in jail in Turkey for political reasons? Or do you think that there is a risk that this kind of meeting will legitimize the Turkish regime? Thank you.
Would you like to answer? Because the Council of Europe was specifically mentioned, and I think you're amongst the panelists, the person with the most Bologna expertise.
Do I have a choice?
Well, since what I just said, not really anymore,
Yeah, okay.
no.
Of course the risk is there, but all countries in the Bologna process actually take turn chairing, co-chairing the bodies. It would be a quite dramatic step to skip one country in the co-chairing process. That said, so Turkey will co-chair with Finland. in this semester, the discussion about the content of the Rome communique will start. We will certainly, there's a number of us, and I think I have one on my right here also, who will do our best also to put the issues of academic freedom and institutional autonomy into the next communique. We will start certainly that discussion also in the board meeting. Don't expect the board on this occasion to make a public statement on academic freedom and institutional autonomy in Turkey, but expect both the board and the broader BFUG to put also the more painful issues, aspects of the academic freedom and institutional autonomy discussion on the table in the context of the next communique, in which the Minister of Turkey, as well as all the other 47 ministers, including some countries that have issues, also political issues, will be invited, I hope, to underline the importance of academic freedom and institutional autonomy also for European democracy.
All right, thank you. I've seen one hand in the back first and then in the front.
Hi, good morning. My name is Pilar Aramburu Zavala. I come from the Autonomous University of Madrid in Spain, and I am the president of the Service Learning Association in higher education in Spain. And, well, you have been mentioning academic autonomy and also the need to explore new methodologies that make social responsibility of the universities real. And there are many ways in which universities are doing that, you know, the volunteering services and international cooperation and participatory action research. But there is a methodology that probably some of you already know that is called service learning, that is widely used in almost, well, I would say in all regions of the world, and much less in Europe, right? But this is changing, unfortunately, little by little, or quite rapidly, I would say, because in some European universities already, teachers using their autonomy, academic autonomy, are using this methodology that combines learning objectives with service objectives for the purpose of learning by serving the community, improving and contributing to change society at the same time that they are making learning or reaching learning goals, right? So this is a tool that we have available and is growing from mouth to mouth, but institutionalization of this methodology, I think, is very important, and we need the support of institutions and international organizations like the Council of Europe and the support of rectors, you know, if we understand that, for example, volunteering is something very useful, very important, and all universities almost in Europe have these services, then we should even more support this new methodology that is service learning, that combines learning objectives, is integrated in the syllabus, in the syllabi, is connected directly with contents in every it can be used in every subject, in every degree, and in any university, right? So at least once during this academic life of students, every single student in Europe should have the opportunity to work for the society with this methodology that is linked to specific subjects. And more than a question, what I have is I'm asking you to please support from where you are. There are lots of things that can be done to support the use of this methodology in your universities and in your area. So please do what you can. Thank you.
Thank you. Would you like to comment as a rector on the
Yes.
approach of service learning?
Yes, thank you for this suggestion, which is a very interesting suggestion, and I will exploit ways of supporting this. I think that letting our students experiment with these methodologies and with the things I try to explain in my contribution today is crucial for their growth as a human being, not only as an engineer or a computer scientist or a mathematician. The point is that in all this we have to find ways and tools to incentivize the participation of students to these activities. You know, we have, at least in my university, but in other universities, we have forms of involvement of students in services, right? We call them part-time students. They work for a limited period of time in offices, in libraries, in departments, etc., for 150 hours, because these are Italian regulations. But this is not what you are thinking about, and what you are thinking about, I think. We are thinking about an involvement in the services, in the management of the services, whatever the service is. The point is, find ways of attracting students to do this. And I don't know. Actually, I don't have an answer to this question. But maybe we could think of credits, or giving credits to the students who participate actively in this co-management or active service, as you said. And we can exploit our regulatory autonomy that at least we still have. I hope we will have in the future as well, to find ways, regulation for supporting this concretely.
Maybe as the only student up here, I would like to take the chance to comment on that as well. I hope that's okay for everybody, because I think obviously it's a very, very interesting approach to try to encourage students to get more involved in civil services and volunteering, etc. And I think it's also important to give the opportunity of integrating that into curriculum. But I think you should not forget that students are at universities in order to receive and participate in a scientific education. Being part of the academic administration is part of being part of the academic community. But volunteering in different matters is not necessarily, which does not mean that it should be excluding one another. And I think the idea of giving credits for civic engagement is not new to me, and I think it's very charming, but it also adds or instrumentalizes civic engagement for credits, and I think that can also be a risk when supporting students in order to see civic engagement as something that they receive something from. And I think because obviously I see the difficulty in enabling everybody to participate in engagement, in volunteering, etc. But I think the tools in order to do that should be on different levels, and those levels are structural levels. They are funding, they are all of those things that students need in order to participate in education, and they should not instrumentalize engagement in civic society. Okay, that was a brief comment, I'm sorry. And now I'd like to give the word to the front, and then we have another person who wants to ask a question.
Thank you. My name is Una Viðarsdóttir. I'm from the Ministry of Education and Science in Iceland. I'm also part of the BFUG, and prior to that I was an academic for 15 years in the UK, so I have an experience from various sources. I want to go back a little bit to what we spoke about in the beginning, which is the way in which the Bologna process may have failed or abandoned academic freedom in the 20 years that we've had. And we've now then heard about the commitment of the ministers, we've heard about the work that's going on that Shul's taking part in, etc. But I still also, it brings me back to at least the work that I've been involved with in the Bologna process, where I felt that often with the Bologna process and the BFUG and the EHEA and the ministers associated therewith have been woefully slow to react to breaches on academic freedom, and often are completely silent on those issues. And I think some of those are due to structural problems with the governance of the BFUG and with the very few meetings we have, and the way that the co-chairs of the BFUG sometimes feel that they don't have the power to speak for the Bologna process as a whole. And I wonder if you want to comment a little bit on what we could do within the BFUG, within the meetings of ministers, within the Bologna process as a whole, to maybe be able to react a bit more to those breaches of really what are our common values. Thank you.
Did you raise your hand? No. Okay. Who would like to react to that? Kind of like, well, looking at you a little bit, or do you want to say something? Or you can both say something, obviously.
You start this time.
No, you go.
Okay. I think the main communications platform for the Bologna process is through the ministerial communiques. Now, it sounds boring. Ministerial communique is perhaps not what people rush to read. Nevertheless, this is where the political authorities of the Bologna process actually speak, and of course the communiques are prepared in the Bologna follow-up group. Can we challenge our ministers, but also ourselves, to be more specific about certain countries? We can try. I'm not sure it will succeed or not. We know that from political processes, and not just in the Bologna process, but in higher education. There is considerable reluctance among political decision makers to pinpoint their colleagues from other countries as being deficient in politically sensitive areas. As I said, saying your qualifications framework is not perhaps 100% is one thing. Saying your academic freedom or institutional autonomy is deficient is a much more difficult step to take. It is a difficult balance between pointing out the principles and the breaches and keeping a dialogue going. I'm convinced that a broken dialogue, also with those who do not fulfill the basic requirements, as long as that dialogue can get going, we should not break it. We may get into a situation where also the authorities of the countries that are in violation would want to break off the dialogue. We're not quite there yet. So I think the next communique, finding the right formulation on academic freedom, institutional autonomy, and also staff and student participation will be important. It will not be easy.
Would you like to add something?
I mean, just very briefly, I think probably one of the structural advantages that the consultative organisations have, like ESSU or Education International, ETUCE, the European region as we're known, is you have a bit more license to kind of make those comments or to identify particular egregious examples of violations. I mean, if it's just the stakeholder groups, then that can be problematic in its own right, but there is a bit of scope, I think, to do that, albeit recognising the kind of political complexities that exist in the BFUG in terms of wider process. But there is that scope to do that, and I think maybe we can do that in a more systematic way, be a bit more kind of proactive in doing that rather than reacting each time.
We had another raising hand in the back. With you, raise your hand again. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for a very nice session. My name is Maria Alme. I come from Western Norway University, Bergen, Norway. And I was thinking about what you talked about, the participated democracy, and also the challenges of political systems that are reducing our academic freedom. I'm an associate professor at the university there, and so I can say we with the academic staff. So the question is a little bit, how can maybe Bologna process help to pinpoint what I would call the academic responsibility of being in a dialogue in the society? Because in many countries I see that it's difficult to be in the public discussions. In my country it's still definitely possible. It's sometimes unpleasant, but still it's not dangerous. But I think it's very important to reduce the political challenge by having an academic freedom. Do you see what I mean here? How can we use the Bologna process to ensure that we as academic staff speak up, both with the facts and our opinions? Because I think, at least in my country, we see that it's not always that political decisions are made on knowledge, and I think it's our responsibility to give that knowledge. Can we use the Bologna process for this?
I have academic stuff sitting to the right of me, so maybe you want to respond to that?
I'm not
both?
academic stuff,
Well,
my initial feeling would be you need to have a stable employment that is not going to be challenged because of what you are saying. Because other than that, you are self-censoring at the levels that you might not even be aware. And in this sense, I think that the larger trend towards precarization of academic work prevents us from having more engagement of the universities and their academics. So that's one. And the second thing is that it requires time. Doing it well requires time, and whether there is an incentive structure within our universities to support however you want to call it, whether you call it third mission or do you call it public dissemination or engagement or speaking up for the values or for the truth or for in defense, or being, as in Denmark, the universities are charged to be the critic and the conscience of the society. I mean, this is a good idea. Let's make sure that we create the conditions that do not undermine our ability of doing so. So that would be my idea, but I'm sure Rob has something to say.
Yeah, I just wanted to pass on to Rob, if that's okay for the audience, because we are back at working conditions, and maybe you can also find out what the Bologna process can do for employees in higher education institutions.
Yeah. One thing we've tried to do in terms of ETUCE is to make sure that, as part of the regular communiques, that a recognition that to have a supportive working environment, so I think you mentioned time, but also some degree of job security is necessary. I think not just to uphold academic freedom, but it's an essential kind of part of quality higher education and research. So I think making that link between working conditions and good experience for students, but also the future of the knowledge base. And we've talked a lot about, yesterday, the big challenges facing us at the global level, climate change, the impacts of artificial intelligence on societies, these kind of big long-term strategic challenges for governments, for institutions and for societies. And a colleague from Norway, it reminds me of a comment from a Norwegian colleague of ours who said, how are you going to save the planet on a 6-month contract? And it kind of links that issue about, are we serious about some of these long-term challenges, or issue about students and their role in societies and communities, these kind of long-term issues, I think we do need to be cognizant of the conditions in which people are employed to kind of ensure that there is quality higher education and research in the HEA.
Yes, also from a perspective of student-centeredness, I'm quite positive that continuity in staff is super important. And I guess that's also a very concrete point, which is already addressed in the Teaching and Learning Advisory Group of the Bologna process at the moment, and I hope they talk about that. So we are drawing near the end. Is there any one more short question? There's one, which is then the last one.
My name is Stefano Bianchini. I'm in the University of Bologna. It's more a comment rather than a question, because I would like to connect again to the last question about what the Bologna process may do in order to strengthen the autonomy of a university and the freedom of academic freedom. We should be very aware about the extremely wide kind of infringements of the autonomy that may occur according to the countries. In some way, the presentation that we had this morning, for instance, gave to us some ideas that is so difficult to understand the picture of the different kind of infringements. This depends on countries. We have the extreme cases, at least in the European continent, we have heard in Turkey and Hungary. But we might be also aware that power, political power, can interfere in different ways. For instance, even in the management, in the organization of the management, of the economic management of the universities. This has been done even in our framework in Italy, where the universities are very often treated as post office in the mechanism how the management of the economy of the administration is done. But there are other countries where, for instance, the power interfere even on the syllabi, on the selection of the textbooks, and restricted the choice to few books that are selected as coherent with the strategy and the politics of the government. So I think that and this occurs in Europe. Or sometimes there are public administrations, not, for instance, in candidate countries, public administrations that control completely the budget of the universities. So I think that from this point of view, we need to have a clear picture of what is happening, and then to see whether, for instance, some key point, like for instance, the Magna Carta, the observatory of the Magna Carta, or the European University Associations, or other institutions like this, can work and lobby and create a task force that can, from this point of view, let's say, in some way take care of what is happening about the freedom of the academic freedom, and what can be suggested in order to overcome the infringements that occur.
Okay, thank you. So we are really a little bit over time, so I'm going to ask if there's any last comments from the panelists I have on my sides. There's not, I think, no? Then I'd like to thank all of you for being here with me and for answering my questions and the questions of the audience. I think we have some very interesting points that will be reported back to the big plenary session. And yeah, thank you for your attention and for being here with us.